So we'll just start with a prayer in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Saint Joseph the worker, whose feast is it today? Nobody knows. All the angels and saints. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. Good to see you all again. Thanks for coming, and hi to all the people at home. So, as you know, today we're doing the Republic from, and there's sections of the Republic in this reader. Now, this is probably, you could even put this in the top 10 books of most famous and most influential philosophy books in the history of philosophy. And it's not only a book that is of interest to philosophers because it's had a wide impact on culture and society at large. That doesn't mean that everyone agrees with what Plato claims or the picture of society that he proposes, but the questions that he raises, the dialogue, the themes of the dialogue, and the very idea of a utopia, and lots of other questions like what's the relation between the individual and the society, and the good of the whole society versus the good of the individual. So many other different themes that are what you'd call classic themes that have been grappled with in Western society ever since. And you'll even find, if you become familiar with this work, as I indicated earlier, there are references either implicit or explicit to this work in even contemporary culture. I've mentioned some of the young adult fiction that's been written lately, and some of that's been turned into movies as well. Dystopian, where there's an intentional organization of society, where society has collapsed, that there's been some apocalyptic event, and they've planned society from the ground up, and they've given different types of people different roles in society. And that type of theme obviously harkens back to this work. The Matrix as well. And why do you think that? Yes, so the allegory of the cave, which we'll get to, thank you. So the idea that the mass of people who are not enlightened are all blind. They think they're aware of reality, but in fact, they're just living in the shadows. And the role of the philosopher, according to Plato, is to know what the truth is, climb out of the cave, come back and show others what the reality is. And the Matrix is one version of that story. Okay. So what I'm going to do today, obviously in the second half, we're going to try and discuss and read the reading that was prescribed. We won't be able to get through all of it. But before that, I want to give an overview of the 10, because there are 10 books in the Republic. But first I want to emphasize that this is a massive work. It operates on many different levels at the same time. It shifts back between the perspective that focuses on the individual to the perspective that focuses on the society as a whole. And as I indicated, I think 2 weeks ago, Plato draws an analogy between the organization of the city and the organization of the soul. And there are all sorts of interesting moves and side paths that Plato goes on to try and make his point through the voice of Socrates. So at a very general level, the Republic is about justice. The Republic is about justice, all right? Now, what you need to remember when you're reading these classic works is that you can't assume that the word they're using has the same sense as the sense we would use for a word. So you need to keep in mind that when we say justice today, we bring all sorts of presuppositions and experiences based on how democracy has developed in Western society, liberalism and the focus on the individual's freedom, the English rule of law, all sorts of things like that. But in the Republic, we're in a different world where there are certain things that occur that we would find very unjust. Like there are slaves, and Plato doesn't really emphasize the freedom of the individual as much as we would today. So we might think, well, how is this just? Well, you need to think about how is using the word just, all right? So justice, in the classical sense, is more about order. Justice is about the ordering of society and things being harmonized in the correct way. And I'm just going to get my pen out to draw that contrast for you. The Greek, that might be slightly correct, but it's something like that. And keep in mind, you've got this contrast between the rights of the individual versus the good of the whole or the collective, which is society as a whole. And you have different political theories and different political systems that are on this continuum. Libertarianism would be one political theory that focuses very much on the individual. So laws should only be set up to allow the individual to make his or her mind up about what's right for them. There's no general sense of what's good. Everyone has to work out what the good is for themselves, and they pursue it individually. The opposite would be collectivism. An extreme version of that would be communist totalitarian government, where the philosophy or the rule or the way of life is determined by the politicians at the top and imposed on everyone, and everyone has to fit in with that. And there's very little room, if any, for individual freedoms. Now, Plato in this book is veering more this way, all right? How far does he go along here? Is he totalitarian or is he not totalitarian? That's up for debate, really. And what you find in reading these texts is that you can get a sense of where Plato is going, but it's hard to pin down exactly how totalitarian it is. Totalitarianism, what I mean by that is where there's very little emphasis on individual freedom and very little emphasis on, I suppose, those local forms of society like the family and the local church. Okay, so that's just the general framework for you and the general questions. So Plato, and remember that these works, Plato is explaining his views through Socrates. So Socrates is speaking in a dialogue with others, and Plato is using the character of Socrates to explore his own views. And this is a work that's in the middle period. And as I explained last week or the week before, as we get closer to the later period, we see more and more Plato's own views, so that Socrates is more of an avatar for Plato. And the Republic is definitely a very highly theoretical work. That's in contrast to the early works, which are, there's less metaphysics and there's less ethical theory. Okay. So this work was authored around 375 BC. Just tell me if that's all right. Okay. And it seems the setting of the dialogue seems to be the Peloponnesian War, whole topic in itself that I'm not going to go into. And I've told you what the main theme is, justice, but there is a question. And the question is one that I think is worth thinking of. It's one of those, there are certain philosophical questions that you can keep returning to again and again. They're called classic questions. And I do talk about this a lot, is that there are works of poetry, there are works of fiction, there are works of philosophy, works of music that you'd say they're classic in the sense that they're deep, they're substantial, and that you can keep returning to them, and society over time has kept returning to them because there's something in them that's quite rewarding, and there's always more to explore and unpack. And the Republic is one of those works, but also there are themes that are classic in that sense, and the theme of justice and also the theme of what makes humans happy or fulfilled is one of those classic questions. And the Republic actually relates those two questions together. So what is justice? And that question has two dimensions: justice for the individual, justice for society. And then the second question is, why be just? Why should we be just? An alternative way of asking that question is someone who is just, sorry, I'll start again. Is the most just person always going to be the most blessed or the most happy or the most fulfilled? And Socrates has a few different dialogue partners, and one of them says, well, actually, it would be wisest if you could just do what's most advantageous for yourself if you can get away with it. So for his point of view, Thrasymachus's view, his view you might call nihilistic or relativistic, or you might say it's a view in which might is right. On his view, if you have the power or the ability somehow to do what's advantageous for yourself or for your group of friends or for your own party, and use whatever means you want, it's better for you to do that than to be just. All right, so a bit of a cynical view. I'll repeat it. He's arguing that it's better, it's wiser and it's better for someone if they can get whatever they want, but by whatever means they can, if they can get away with it. No. Thrasymachus. It's very similar, yeah. Similar. THR. I'll write it up. Similar, yeah. The idea is that power is the most important rather than searching for truth. And what's really interesting is that, we might think, oh, why this guy's an idiot. Why would he have that view? But it's useful to have that dialogue partner in this dialogue, because it then forces Socrates to try and defend his view. Okay, so if a tyrant can get away with this, why should we be just? All right? I want you to try and appreciate the significance of the question. Why should we be just if you can get away with it? We can get away with not being just. And this actually touches on things that we'd see in some of the Old Testament works, where the question is asked, why do just people suffer? And why do unjust people prosper? Yeah? Similar territory there. And of course, Christianity and the Old Testament have their own answers to that question. Can you see how, as soon as we ask that question, we have to start thinking about divine judgment? And it makes a huge difference whether you put divine judgment into the picture or not. If there is no afterlife, there's certainly less reason and less motivation to be just in this life, isn't there? Yeah. All right. So just to recap, the question is, what is justice and why be just? And I pointed out that once you start pressing into that question, you start to think about questions of divine judgment, whether there is such thing as a divine judge or objective justice. And what I was going to say is that I can't remember which Russian author it was. I think it might have been not Dostoevsky, but the other one, Solzhenitsyn. I think it was him who said that if God doesn't exist, no, it was a Dostoevsky. If God doesn't exist, everything is permissible. Yeah, so it's Dostoevsky. Thank you. Yeah, so the question from the audience was, is that why some people don't believe in God? Because that gives them permission in their mind to do more, or have more, a sense of freedom. Yeah. Well, Sam Harris, the question from the audience was that people like Sam Harris, who are atheists, will argue for atheism as being the most rational point of view. And then the question was, can you fit morality into that? I think ultimately you need some theological framework to make sense of justice. That's my view. Sam Harris tries to make sense of morality in terms of evolution and natural processes. Sorry, you can't do that. It doesn't work. It doesn't work because the fact that people behave in certain ways can't explain why they should behave in certain ways. You can't derive what ought to happen based on facts about what does happen. All right, gone a little bit off a track there, but that's fine. It was related. I'll now go through, how long? Oh, I've got 25 minutes. I'll now go through the 10 books briefly, focusing more on some than others. So the Republic is split up into 10 books. We still okay? Just very briefly, the last book, book 10, we're not going to cover it all. That's about whether a society should have artists and poets and rhetoric. And Plato argues that we shouldn't because it misleads people. And because art imitates things in the world, which in turn imitate the eternal forms. So we're 2 steps removed from the ideal. I'm just going to leave it at that because we don't have much time. So the in book 1, we have a man called Cephalus, and he's old, and Socrates asks him, what's life like at when you get to that age? He sort of asks him in a quite rude fashion, really. What's it like to be that old? And he answers that the good thing about old age is our passions are easier to control because they're somewhat abated, and so we're more free to dedicate yourself to justice and the contemplation of wisdom. All right? So that's sort of the icebreaker, as you like, if you like. And then Socrates then asks the others that are gathered around him, how would you define justice? And we already know what Socrates likes to do. Socrates likes to ask questions, get their answers, and show them that their answers don't work. A bit irritating, I would think, but that's what he did. Cephalus says, well, justice is to give to each what is owed to them. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Polemarchus says, to give to each what is appropriate to him. That's harder to explain, but I'm not going to dwell on that. Thrasymachus says, justice is just about what's advantageous for the stronger. So whoever's got the most power, they define what's right and wrong. All right? And Socrates then refutes each one of those. The first example he gives is that let's say I have a friend and they've lent me a knife. To make it more contemporary, I'll say it's a gun. They've lent me a gun, and I've got to give it back to him because it belongs to him, right? There's some sort of, he has some sort of ethical claim over that gun, and I should give it back to him. He asked for it back, but I know that he's gone a bit bonkers, and he wants to harm somebody, or you think he might want to harm somebody, or you're not sure what's going to happen. All right, would returning the gun be a just thing? So Socrates is pointing that out as an example of perhaps giving everyone what's due to them is not a good definition of justice, right? Aquinas actually deals with this same question later on. I'm going to skip the second one. Third one, not the second book, the second answer to what's just, to give to each what's appropriate to them. The third one is it goes into a bit of detail, but what Socrates says in response to Thrasymachus is that every techne, which is a craft, every techne or skill or craft aims at creating a good, fashioning a good object. And political rulers have their own techne, their own skill of ruling, and it aims at the good of their object, which is the good of society. So therefore, a political ruler should aim at the good of the society, the benefit of the ruled, and not the benefit of the ruler. No, it doesn't. What you'll find reading these dialogues is that you might be not satisfied. You might not be satisfied with some of the answers Socrates gives. And I mean, there have been debates with debates by philosophers as to the extent to which he is actually answering the questions and whether we think his arguments are good. However, the point really is the themes that he's raising and how the dialogue's moving on, where it's going. That's right. So it doesn't really answer why we should be just. And as I indicated right at the start, Thrasymachus says that the unjust person is wiser than the just person. Because if you're clever enough to get away with getting everything that you want in ways that we would say is unfair, then good for him or her. All right? And as you're reading these dialogues, it's good to try and get inside the mindset of each of these points of view, get inside the mind of Thrasymachus. What does it mean to think like that? And what would the consequences be? Because that definitely, it does present a problem for Socrates. And the rest of the book is his attempt to answer that question. So how is he going to answer the question, why be just? Well, first he needs to define what justice is. You can't answer the question of why be just unless you know what justice is. And that's a theme that always comes up. The what is question. Socrates and Plato are the first philosophers really to press into that question of asking about the essence of things. What is the essence of X? All right. So book 2 now. And there's a myth called the ring. I believe they're soft G's. So the ring of Gyges. So I'm just going to quote something that I read about this. The story of Gyges is when someone who has a ring that turns invisible, and because of this, he can achieve great advantages for himself by committing all sorts of things that are unjust. And many would think that anyone would use the ring in that way if they had it. Put up your hand if you think most people would use the ring in that way if they had it. Put up your hand if you think some would. Put up your hand if you're not sure. Put up your hand if you think most would refuse the ring. Okay, so that's the question. The first question was, would people use it? The next question is, should you use it? Glaucon, Glaucon, is saying not only people would, but they should. So that point of view is called ethical egoism, where what you should do is whatever increases your own advantage, increases your own pleasure, happiness, regardless of the consequences for other people, regardless of any ethical principles or right or wrong or greater good. So that's similar to Thrasymachus's view. And again, it's just pressing home that question to Socrates. Okay, for the person that refuses to use the ring, why do they do that? Why should someone not use the ring to get everything they want for themselves using whatever means necessary? Why not do that? And in fact, what's really at the heart of that question is lost my train of thought. I'll come back to that. Okay, yes. So the question is, the person who chooses not to use the ring, the person who, I guess, chooses moral principle and to follow truth and justice, are they happier? Are they in a better position? Are they more blessed? Are they more well off? Socrates wants to argue yes. Socrates wants to argue that it's best for us to act justly. So Socrates, sorry, when I say Socrates, I mean Plato, because he's speaking through Socrates. Plato wants to establish that to maximize our happiness, this is a hard word to translate because it's eudaimonia. Flourishing, success in life. It's a hard one to translate because often happiness sounds a bit feeling oriented. Yes. No. He is, yes. Definitely is. So you'll find that his partners in dialogue partners, are focusing more on the external things, as you say, achieving honor, recognition before others, or achieving wealth, because wealth allows you to do all sorts of things that you couldn't otherwise do, achieving power. But Plato is moving towards a more interior, spiritual dimension, something that it's not the same as Christianity, but it's approaching that in that direction. Something more purified and ideal, less worldly. What he wants to say is that when we act justly, our soul does well. When we act justly, our soul does well. When we act unjustly, our soul does not do well. Our soul is unhealthy. And in this book, as far as I'm aware, Plato doesn't go into details about someone who is morally pure and yet suffers a lot in this world? Because that is the great paradox or difficulty with this view, is that it does appear that people who are the most moral, the most pure, have the highest principles, can be the ones who suffer the most or are taken advantage of. So, judging by outward appearances and also the experience of the person, it can seem that it's not the best outcome for people to do the right thing. And the converse would be that it seems, from a certain perspective, it seems that it's better for people to at least sometimes act without principle. In order, just think about life today, it's far easier to go along with what other people believe in order to prevent people from looking down at you, prevent people from cancelling you, even prevent you from losing your job, or and there are people going through court cases at the moment for speaking up about certain things. Do you get my point here? Yeah. So there's a big question mark over it. So Socrates is saying the person who acts justly is in a better position. But if you think about this in worldly terms, it doesn't seem to be true, does it? Hmm. It's a good point that someone in the audience said, is that there's the prisoner who went back to the cave. So this is the story about the person who manages to escape from the cave of illusions and see the truth. So you could read that as someone who prophetically sees that worldly values are not the ultimate values, and someone who comes back can see that it's worth suffering for what you know is right and true. In my view, Plato is asking some very profound questions that philosophy as such cannot answer. I think that it's raising all sorts of questions that you can only have answers to if you bring in faith. Okay, you've got about 15 minutes. The books 2 to 4 are really the heart of the book, and they're about the city and the soul. And you've got three types of persons in society that match up with three different faculties of the soul. So reason, which matches up with logos, reason which is logos. There's the logical, reasonable faculty of the soul. That's the part that is interested in the truth for its own sake and objectivity, and doesn't just consider, you don't just consider your own experiences or your own point of view, but you try to be objective and consider all people. So that's logos, and that's concerned with wisdom. I'll write these up. And as you can probably predict, in the ideal society, the people that have this the most are the ones that are fit to rule the society. Then you've got tumos, This is hard to translate. One translation that sort of works is spirit. And when we say spirit, we might think intellect, or we might think the Holy Spirit. We might think demons or angels. But that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about spiritedness. So if someone does something with this inspirited, it means they do it with a lot of gusto, strength, courage, confidence. Okay? So that's to do with the energy, confidence, and it's to do with honor as well, in particular honor. So the class that's related to logos are the philosophers. Spirit, or thumos, these are the guardians, fighters, the warriors that make sure they keep order in society through force, keep law and order, make sure the barbarians don't overtake from the outside. According to Plato, this is a subordinate, a lesser function, and if people start to seek honor above all, things start to go wrong. It's not that honor is a bad thing, but if you make that first rather than wisdom, things start to go wrong in a society. And he has a story about how societies collapse, and that's one of the first stages. And then we've got, in this story, you've got also Eros. Sorry, this is all over the place. I'll put it up here. Logos. In other works, Eros has this transcendent function by which Eros can start off being a basic desire, but it can be purified and elevated until it becomes a passionate desire for the good, higher things. In this work, at least in this section, he's talking about appetites. Sorry, that's very messy. I'll do it again. Bodily appetites, really. And remember, he's got a very he's got a schema of how society should work. He's got this utopian vision. And in his vision, people that are stronger with this, people that are stronger in the eros, or the bodily appetite, they're the ones that are going to be better at doing those so-called lower things, like laboring in the fields. The peasants. Well, he knows that. He knows that, but he would say that those necessities are still only those bare physical necessities, and that the spiritual element is better. I'm not saying, I mean, there's certainly force in your objection there, but I'm just saying what he would reply. Oh,
People of less value, they're lower in the
oh. Does he say they have less value?
they would object to that.
Well, I don't even know that because you could argue that Plato is saying that you get your value and your meaning from the society as a whole. So even if you're down here doing menial work, You could argue that that's fine because everyone's getting their sense of purpose and value from the whole. I don't think that's an entirely satisfactory answer, but yeah. But in my view, you start to ask, okay, what has to be in place? What beliefs have to be in place in order to preserve the dignity of each individual? And the second question is, does he give enough room for the dignity of the individual? I'll let you decide that one. I'm just going to really quickly summarize in the next 2 or 3 minutes. Yeah, the producing classes. All right. So I can't do justice to justice in the Republic in the time that I've got left, but very briefly, remember the question was, what is justice? And we want to answer that so that we know why be just. Why not just do what's advantageous for ourselves if we can get away with it? He tries to answer that question by answering what is just, and the way he tries to answer what is justice is by drawing an analogy between justice in the individual soul and justice in society as a whole. And the way he answers that is by laying out a utopian ideal society in which logos rules, because the philosophers, the ones with the most wisdom, are in a better place to organize society. And then he brings in the myth of the person who is enlightened because they're no longer in that cave of illusion. And Tumos and Eros, they don't disappear, but they come into their right place. And he develops this picture by giving some really interesting narratives about what happens when these lower functions start to rule. You start to sink into timocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and then tyranny. Democracy is not a fan of democracy. Okay. And he draws an analogy between that, disorder in society, and disorder in the soul. And whether or not he ends up tying all those threads together at the end is an open question. But to summarize, it's an amazing work and certainly raises a lot of questions. And I think from my experience, even after you say you're very familiar with Church's doctrine on social justice or the Church's teaching on the human person, going back to this is still quite enlightening because it shows you which questions and themes are important. If you know how important these questions are, then the significance of the Church's answers are highlighted more. Okay.